All I have for you is a gesture in combination with a word, Tenet. Use it carefully.
Whenever looking at the filmography of Christopher Nolan, the film that is considered the worst by many is Tenet. If you go online and look at pretty much any type of review website or ranking of Christopher Nolan movies, it seems to always be at or near the bottom. While it's definitely not considered terrible by most, it seems like the common consensus is that it's a bit too confusing, smug and full of itself, and it thinks that it's smarter than it actually is. This film seems to be the black sheep of Christopher Nolan's filmography, and it seems to be misinterpreted by many. A lot look for meaning and symbolism in trying to dissect the whole thing. How are you going to feel about Tenet is basically summed up in this one line. During an exposition scene, this is said.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
That's pretty much going to determine if you enjoy this film or not. Either you'll get into it, picking up enough detail on the way to not get lost, or you'll just be confused the whole time trying to understand it. Recently, Christopher Nolan was interviewed about this film, and he had this to say.
Do I have to get your film, or can I experience your film?
If you experience my film, you are getting it. And that, I feel very strongly about that. I think that where people encounter frustrations with my narratives in the past, sometimes I think they're slightly missing the point. It's not a puzzle to be unpacked. It's an experience to be had. You're not meant to understand everything in Tenet. It's not all comprehensible. I have to have my idea of it for it to be a valid, productive ambiguity. But the point of it is it's an ambiguity.
Because of the unique approach to the story, I don't really want to go over the plot details too much, but more so over some of the scenes and why they work for this very unique brand of spectacle. We start out with the sound of an orchestra tuning for a concert. And whenever I heard this intro, I realized just how many movies use this.
Wow, if I had a nickel.
I love how this first scene shows the whole approach that this movie has to time without hitting you over the head with it. We open up on a circular orchestra amphitheater, reflecting the circular plot structure of the film. While some of Nolan's other flicks operate on a non-linear structure, with some being in reverse and many having scenes that take place non-chronologically, this one plays with time in more of a circular way, where everything is in a narrative sequential order. But because of the gimmick of reversing time, there is essentially a circular narrative structure, where we come to a certain point in the story and we circle back around.
Start with the simple stuff. Every law of physics.
And the scene, we start with a sense of familiarity, before all of a sudden, we're shot directly into the thick of it. I really like how we start out with an action scene here that's somewhat understandable, becoming progressively more confusing. We start out with a standard heist before introducing the main gimmick in a striking way. While there's some great setup and foreshadowing of the plot structure in this scene, but the biggest issue unfortunately also rears its ugly head in this scene too.
Granny's expecting a passenger. I've never seen a cancellation.
I can't hear you, Peach.
The sound mixing here is honestly not very good. It works from an immersion standpoint, but if you actually, want to hear what the characters are saying in this movie, then it's basically impossible. That's especially a big issue because this movie is filled to the brim with exposition scenes. I usually don't watch films with subtitles since I usually find it distracting from taking in more of what's going on visually on screen, but this movie is an exception to that. In this movie, you basically have to have subtitles on to understand anything that the characters are saying, which is kind of a big issue because there's a lot of necessary exposition in this movie. That's another issue that comes up, to the point where it can kind of drag the pace down, especially towards the end. But this movie kind of needs a lot of explaining, so there's that too. The exposition scenes in this film kind of bring the pace down a bit, but what really elevates it is those action scenes. This is where the established rules are in play, and all the exposition scenes seem to be worth it to get to this movie's biggest strength, the very unique style of action that it brings. The movie also carries a very apathetic tone throughout it all, which lends itself well to a very dreamlike world that Nolan creates here. The characters here are engaging enough, but they're definitely not what carries the film. This is demonstrated best by the fact that the main character in this movie doesn't have a name. He's just always referred to as the protagonist. And in a way, that's all he needs to be. Probably the greatest strength here is the cinematography. Obviously the action is amazingly shot, with most of it being practical effects. But also, a lot of the exposition scenes are very uniquely framed. Here's one example of that. The scene could have easily been a 4-camera setup with it just cutting back and forth to the characters, but instead it's shot in this circular motion with the characters talking and bringing back up the themes of circularness that are present throughout this whole film. Another part that demonstrates a great use of the show don't tell method is in this scene. This is a pivotal turning point in the movie where we get to that circular structure and it kind of turns around. And to demonstrate the time-altering events during this scene, we get this unique contrast of red and blue, one representing time going forward and the other representing time going backwards. I could talk a bit longer about the plot of this film. Even though it's a decent story with some twists and turns, I don't think that is the reason to watch this. It carries along and is well paced enough, but again, the characters in the story aren't really the focus here. More than anything else, they're a means to an end. Also, I just want to point out that we get this line.
You're familiar with the Manhattan Project? As they approached the first atomic test, Oppenheimer became concerned that the detonation might produce a chain reaction engulfing the world.
I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it reminds me a lot of whenever Pixar used to put Easter eggs in their movies about what their next film would be. While this isn't Nolan's best film, I would definitely disagree with the notion that it's his worst. Though there are some objective flaws here, the things that this movie does well, it does so objectively well and uniquely that there's not really another movie quite like it. At the end of the day, it all comes back to that one line. If you're going to enjoy this movie, you need to put yourself in a certain mindset.